All right, everyone, we're moving on from the Han Dynasty onto the Tang and Song dynasties, with our goal today being able to explain how the Tang and Song dynasties strengthened and transformed China into a prosperous and innovative empire. So you're seeing this kind of pattern here, right? Dynasties rise, dynasties fall, dynasties rise, dynasties fall. This is a common pattern throughout China. If you're looking for a timeline reference, the end of the Han Dynasty takes place right after kind of Rome peaks, right? Rome peaks right around here. The Han Dynasty falls right around before the year 225 CE, and then about a century later, the Roman Empire split between the East and the West, had another civil war before being reunited by Constantine. So that's kind of the period we're talking about right here. So the key question we're trying to figure out here is, how did China reunify after centuries of chaos? So the Han Dynasty, as you can see here in red, massive empire, united all of the Chinese people. However, once it falls, it's now divided into three main kingdoms that are at war with each other. And this goes on for quite a while. So you see this pattern, right? Before the Han Dynasty, you had the period of warring states. The Han Dynasty reunites all of them under one single emperor, the Han family. And then when the Han Dynasty falls, it's divided up into smaller kingdoms that are at war with each other again, right? This dynastic cycle you see repeating. So the Han Dynasty falls around the year 220 CE or AD, depending on the numbering system you prefer, and China was divided among the warring kingdoms for about 350 years. Then, around 581, the Sui family starts the Sui dynasty, reuniting China under Emperor Wendi, restoring centralized government, and this dynasty lasts for, about 40 years. So you can see here the warring kingdoms, and the Sui dynasty then is here in green, kind of reuniting these factions under a new family. Under the Sui dynasty, they built something known as the Grand Canal, which runs down a large part of the western side of what is modern China, and it connects two major rivers linking northern and southern China for trade and food transport. And this becomes huge. It's basically a superhighway of ancient China. However, they only lasted for about 40 years, and the Sui fell because of overwork and high taxes. Right? You see this same pattern happening not just in Chinese dynasties, but across all the empires we've been talking about. When the people who are being ruled over or overworked, overtaxed, they tend to rise up and overthrow their governments. This is why the Roman strategy of distracted minds and full bellies are a great way to keep yourself in power if you ever find yourself in the position of being an emperor of a large empire. So after the Sui dynasty falls, a new dynasty, a new family takes over, known as the Tang dynasty. And the question we're trying to answer here is, how do they create a strong and expanding empire? Because you can see right here that this green area was the Sui dynasty, but this red line, this massive new territory outlined, is the Tang dynasty. So they go quite much but further west in the western reaches of the Great Wall of China itself. You even start to go down into modern Vietnam. The Tang dynasty was founded by a brilliant general and administrator, so that means he was able to conquer new areas, but also was really good at administering and ruling over these lands. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the names of these individual peoples. I'm not going to test you on them. Just know that they rebuilt a strong central government under the Tang dynasty, strengthened the law codes, the legal codes, and reorganized the military to make it more effective. And so the Tang built on the Sui achievements, improved roads and canals that allowed for more transportation, more trade, and more movement of people and ideas. One of their biggest achievements was expanding their borders, as I mentioned, west into Central Asia over here. So Persia is right over here, so they're bordering on Persian territories, north into Manchuria, and south into Vietnam. By 668 CE, the Tang armies had brought Korea under Chinese influence as well. So while Korea was an independent kingdom with their own rulers, they were heavily under the influence of the Chinese emperors. This brings us to a member of the Tang dynasty whose name I do want you to know, Empress Wu Zhao. Now, Wu Zhao was originally a concubine of the emperor, but rose to power after his death through intelligence and political skill. So I like to think of her as very much like a Empress Theodora of the Byzantine Empire. Remember, if you'll remember from our Byzantine lessons, Theodora started out as kind of an actress, some say prostitute, married the emperor, and then kind of rose to be kind of a co-ruler. Well, Wu Zhao was very similar in that she was a concubine of the emperor, but then after his death, kind of replaced him. Now, for a few decades, she ruled behind the scenes before declaring herself the actual first and only female empress of China in the year 690 Common Era, which totally went against the teachings of Confucianism, which said it's the men who should take the lead. But Empress Wu Zhao didn't really care and just took the power for herself. When doing this, she strengthened the bureaucracy to make sure the government ran smoother, expanded China's influence over Korea, as I mentioned earlier, so not conquering Korea, but having a lot of control or sway over their rulers, and also promoted Buddhism as a unifying faith of the Chinese people. Now, the Tang Dynasty was very concerned about promoting stability and good governance because they saw what happened to the previous dynasties. They fell into corruption, fell into instability, and then eventually fell to chaos across China. So the Tang Dynasty was trying to find some way to stop that cycle from repeating. As part of this, they revived and expanded the civil service examination system started by the Han Dynasty in order to test for knowledge of Confucianism, history, and law to make sure that, the people who were actually doing the job of running the government knew what they were doing. The test itself was open to most men, but really only wealthy families could afford the required education to pass these tests, so it really did lead to kind of like an aristocracy, wealthy families being the ones who stayed in power because they were the only ones who could afford the tutors to train their kids to pass these tests. This all created an elite group of scholar officials who formed a merit-based bureaucracy. That is, the people who do the job of government, but they get the jobs not because of who their families are, but because they were able to pass the test to show they knew what they were doing. This did reduce the power of the old noble families by increasing the chance of people to be able to move up the social ladder through education. But again, you had to have the money to get that education, so it wasn't like the peasants were able to completely move up the social ladder, but it did lead to this ability to have some mobility in the hierarchy. Now, of course, the Tang Dynasty did fall to the same dynastic cycle problems as all previous dynasties in China, so let's take a look at what caused their decline. You're going to notice some things here that probably aren't going to surprise you. As the empire grew, the cost of this government and the military campaigns also increased, so the Tang rulers had to impose crushing taxes on the peasants because, well, the wealthier, they're not going to pay the taxes. So this caused increased hardship among the peasant class. They rose up and revolted against their rulers. It's like we just don't learn these lessons from history. Another big blow for the Tang Dynasty happened in 751 when the Tang armies suffered a crushing defeat against the Persian armies from the Islamic Caliphate all the way over here. So the Abbasid Empire that we talked about in a previous unit, yep, they're coming into clashes with the Tang Dynasty over in their outskirts of the empire, and this doesn't go well for the Tang. So like the Roman Empire, the Tang Dynasty just kind of overspread themselves too far. The end result here was once again, local warlords gained power as the central government weakened, and in 907 Common Era, the Chinese rebels destroyed the Tang capital and murdered the last Tang emperor. This led to a pretty well-expected 50 years of chaos or so, where we had 5 different dynasties, 10 kingdoms at war with each other, before one family, the Song dynasty, finally restored order and stability. So let's take a look at how they did that. So after about 50 years of division, the Song dynasty once again reunites China under one rule in 960 Common Era. Now they maintain a much smaller territory. The Tang dynasty was this red area, the Sui dynasty was this green area. The Song dynasty here is this blue line, so it's more within the walls of the Great Wall, easier to defend, a lot smaller, which allowed them to become a lot more stable, and they didn't have to spend as much money defending themselves. The Song also reorganized government to make it function better for the people, expanded trade routes, and promoted Confucianism as a way to reinforce loyalty to the empire. Now, they also used diplomacy and tribute payments with nomadic peoples up in the north here in order to keep them from raiding, right? The Great Wall of China was built to stop the northern nomadic peoples from attacking, but they realized instead of paying people to be in an army and forcing people to fight against the Mongols and these northern tribes, they could just give them silver, silk, and tea, and then they wouldn't attack because you were paying them off, and this allowed the Song dynasty to have some level of stability. Now, both the Tang and Song dynasties are considered a golden age of China, so let's take a look at why. So, combined, the Tang and Song dynasties created one of the most prosperous and innovative periods in all of world history. China's population doubled to nearly 100 million people, and they had multiple cities with over 1 million residents, right? We made a big deal about how Rome had 1 million people in it at its height. The Song and Tang dynasties had multiple cities with that size population. So this gives you an idea of exactly how complex and sophisticated the government system must be in order to have kept all these people fed and under control. It's at this time we saw multiple innovations happening across China. For instance, we saw the first creation of movable type. So this was kind of a early printing press using Chinese characters, an idea that would eventually migrate and find its way to the West in Europe, sparking the Renaissance. In China, as it will eventually in Europe, the printing press here, the movable typescript, will allow for a lot easier book production, which will allow for a more educated population. They also invent gunpowder and create a magnetic compass for navigation and paper money for trade. All these things make life easier for the Chinese people and just show how advanced they were compared to other cultures. They also perfected the art of porcelain at this time, which is why a lot of fine dining ware is called fine china because of the type of porcelain used by the Chinese. And the Chinese also invented the first mechanical clock during the Song Dynasty, used for astronomical observations. So again, very advanced culture. These innovations spread through Asia and later Europe via the trade networks that connected East Asia, China all the way over here to the Middle East. This is where the Islamic Caliphate are, and you can see right here ending in Constantinople as the bridge to eventually Western Europe. This trade route, collectively all these roads, are known as the Silk Road, something that we'll be talking about quite a bit in this unit. So let's talk about how agriculture and trade expanded China's power. So, as the Chinese kind of expanded down here into Vietnam, they discovered a new variety of rice that the Vietnamese people were growing that was fast ripening. Now, fast ripening means that it's a shorter period of time between planting the seed and actually being able to harvest and eat the rice. This allowed for them to grow 2 harvests of rice every year in China. Now, rice is the main staple crop of the Chinese people in East Asia, just like wheat is the main staple of people over in the Mediterranean world that we're talking about. This increased amount of food allowed for China's growing population to be well fed and not starve. And you know the best way to stop people from overthrowing you is keep their bellies full and their minds distracted. So the government distributed rice seeds nationwide across their territory in order to increase productivity and keep people better fed. They also expanded irrigation and terrace farming in order to again increase the crop loads so they could keep all their growing population fed. After all, they had multiple cities with 1 million people living in them. They had to keep all those people fed somehow. Trade then flourished by land on the Silk Roads and sea routes across the Indian Ocean, a trade route that we'll talk about in our next unit known as the Monsoon Marketplace. Now, Chinese ships would use magnetic compasses and large sails, allowing them to reach ports in India, Arabia, and even East Africa as they became the dominant force in the Indian Ocean. These trade routes also allowed Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity to enter China as things weren't just going one way. The ideas and products were going both ways, so these main religions start to enter China around this time. And Tang and Song advances spread to Korea, Japan, and India, as well as the Islamic world, where they will eventually find their way into Europe. So let's talk a little bit about how Chinese society changed under their Tang and Song rule. So, economic prosperity and education created a social mobility for the first time in Chinese culture. That means, essentially, just because you were born poor doesn't mean you're going to have to die poor. You can move up the social hierarchy by getting an education. This leads to the creation of a gentry class, scholar officials and their families who are respected for their education, not for their wealth. Below them were the urban middle class, merchants, artisans, and shopkeepers, while peasants remained the largest class working for the landlords or on small farms. We keep seeing in all these societies, it's the farmers who kind of get screwed over in all of this, despite the fact they're the ones growing the food that keeps all of this running. And then women's status kind of tended to decline during these periods, especially among wealthy families. In poor families, the women needed to work on the farms and kind of pitch in, but if you were in a wealthier family and a woman, your work started to be seen as less valuable, and you were seen more as a symbol of beauty. One of these things was the status of foot binding, where they would actually bind a young girl's foot at a very young age in order to start deforming the bones and muscles within the feet, so they would be able to fit in these tiny little shoes. So this deforming of the human body was seen as a symbol of beauty up until the 1900s. It continued as a way of people trying to replicate the fashion of the ruling class that would do this to the concubines in the emperor's inner circle. This made moving very difficult and pretty painful for women. And that's where we're going to leave off today. So again, I want you to rewrite today's goal. It's always best to type it out. Don't copy and paste. Again, don't copy and paste. Type out 3 important things you learned from this lesson. Complete sentences, complete thoughts. Don't copy and paste. The act of stopping and thinking what you learned, thinking about it, writing it out, it's going to help you remember it. And then think about a question you have. Again, using this information is what's going to help you remember it and help you store it and be able to retrieve it later. So write that question and I will respond to you. All right. Hope it all goes well and we'll see you in class.